Okay. I pity the cameraman because I'm a walker, and I'm going to go down and walk around, so poor cameraman. Okay. I'm 50% E&G and 50% research, so this presentation will be considerably different than Dr. Sollenberger's in that a lot of you are not agronomists and are not familiar with a lot of the terminology we use. So I'm talking about deciduous warm season perennial grasses as feedstocks for the Southeast. Now, with regard to bioenergy, the Independent Energy Act is a noble concept, but there is no doubt it's the price of gasoline that's driving this bus. Here we see the decrease in gasoline as a result of the banking crisis, but ever since then, you see we've been creeping up, and if you look at the last part of the graph here, this is that graph expanded. Is there any doubt where that's going to go? Anybody got any doubts? I don't. All right, so I'm talking about feedstocks that are deciduous, warm season, herbaceous perennial grasses. So whenever you start a class, you always define terms. Deciduous. Everybody in the temperate regions of the US is familiar with deciduous. These are deciduous trees. It is a programmed senescence that allows a plant to recoup its important nutrients. And the grasses I'm talking about do that. As we approach the fall, they undergo a programmed senescence where the top portions die first and pull the nutrients back down to the roots to save the nutrients for a rapid spring emergence. Warm season. You can think of these things in major production when everybody's at the beach. Okay? They come on, their growth comes on a little bit late in the spring, but boy, when it gets hot, they are growing full blast. And like Dr. Sollenberger said, they are very efficient at their growth during this period of time. Another important concept on these grasses is the shoot to root ratio, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Okay, I'm talking about herbaceous material, and that means not woody. Okay? The grasses you see here are herbaceous. Herbaceous material dies down to the ground at the end of the year. Now, there may be some kind of skeleton left, and it's a good thing because that gives us standability in the winter, but typically the material dies down to the crown. All right, perennial. You know, the one thing that they say is the only thing you can be assured of is death and taxes. Well, death is a one-time event, but taxes are perennial. And now that I've ruined everybody's day, because that's coming up, perennial growth means, or perennial growth is an augmentation of the deciduousness of these plants, and that the deciduous nature allows nutrients to be pulled down to the roots. The roots persist there for a very long time. Perennial means they grow back every year. Some of the grasses that I'm talking about will grow back 15 or 18 years without any modification of the system. This happens to be switchgrass growing back. Okay, and grasses. Okay. When I was a kid growing up in New York, and I did grow up just outside of New York City, oddly enough, I'm in agriculture again in the South, but when I grew up in New York City, I was first generation off the farm, and this was the grass that I was familiar with. And I don't know how many of you remember, but I remember seeing the sequel to Lonesome Dove, and there was a grass fire in Nebraska. And several people got burned seriously and killed. And me being familiar with this grass, I couldn't understand how someone could be killed in a grass fire. The grasses you see here are well over 10 feet tall, And if you have ever been around a switchgrass or giant miscanthus field when it burns, we typically burn 1/4 of an acre plot just to maintain it. And I did some calculations off of that. In 60 seconds, which is all it took to burn the 1/4 of an acre, in 60 seconds we release 12 million BTUs of energy. So these are gigantic grasses. Okay, the 2 grasses I'm going to focus on are switchgrass and giant miscanthus. Now, I make a big deal out of calling it giant miscanthus because giant miscanthus is seed sterile, and as such has less of a chance of being invasive than Miscanthus sinensis, which is the miscanthus you see planted around homes and landscapes. And it is starting to get invasive in several areas. I was just up in Pennsylvania visiting my parents, and PennDOT planted along the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and it is all over in eastern Pennsylvania around King of Prussia. If you go to the Great Smoky Mountains in North Carolina, it has gotten away, and it is up and down the interstates along eastern North Carolina, particularly a problem there. So we focus on giant miscanthus and switchgrass. And with regard to my plots, switchgrass is the biggest invasive species. It moves all over. We're constantly roguing it out of our other plots to keep the yield assessments true. So we typically get switchgrass yields of 5 to 8 tons and giant miscanthus of 10 to 16, sometimes higher. If the yield is perfect or the year is perfect, we get considerably higher yields off of each of these. Okay, the land area that I'm talking about is north of I-10. And you'll see Dr. Solenberger's area focus was here, and sugarcane and energy cane here. I do test energy cane and sugar cane, but I'm located right about here. And we get, if I go 90 miles south, I get a 2-ton greater yield in energy cane. So we're really at the northern limits for energy cane. Sugar cane and elephant grass for me, we have fantastic yields every once in a while. For elephant grass, we can get 19 US tons, so roughly double that for metric tons. 19 US tons in a given year, and then it can go to 0 if we have a cold winter. So that's why I'm focused on these grasses. You'll notice the slide says land for the biomass crops will not come from row crop land. And the reason I use this map deliberately, because a lot of the DOE maps focus in on the Mississippi Delta, right here, and list it as a high production area. You're not going to get bioenergy crops in there because you will have to displace corn, soybeans, rice, and cotton. And all of them have a much higher value than biomass, which, think about it, if you want the gasoline in your vehicle to be cheap, you want the feedstock going into the system to be cheap. Okay. Okay, so who cares about those terms? Well, let's go back to deciduous. Okay, deciduous material or deciduous plants recoup the nutrients from the crown before the onset of winter, and this is a very orderly process. We've done some work with these grasses and compared them with tropical species. And the significance of recouping the nutrients means that fertilizer inputs are considerably lower, especially N, P, and K. Okay? What's the significance of those? They're the numbers that are on your standard fertilizer bag. Okay? When you put out fertilizer, 13 is 13% nitrogen, 13% phosphorus, and 13% potassium. And so these are the big 3 nutrients that a plant needs to maximize growth. And so deciduous crops actually can recoup most of these. For regrowth on these crops, and Dr. Sullenberger was talking about highs of 200 pounds, kilos per hectare, roughly pounds per acre. For our grasses, under the systems we use, we need to sustain yield, we need 50 pounds of N, okay, right there. That should wake everybody up. This is a really important concept because nitrogen is the biggest cost to grow a grass crop. It's also the biggest source of carbon inputs in growing a crop, because to make that nitrogen, we have to burn natural gas to fix that nitrogen. And so it does represent a huge input in the production of these grasses. And for us, this potassium recommendation varies by soil. For us, that's actually fairly high. Some soils don't need a potassium supplement. Okay, the other advantage of being deciduous is we're typically dry at the end of the season. The crop stands dry, and even if you get heavy rains, it's like laundry out there. That crop is standing as individual stalks. When a front comes through and rain comes down, the weather right after the front is typically very low humidity, and so a crop that's standing in the field dries when those dry winds blow through it. We do recommend in these grass crops that you harvest only once, and I'll talk about that in just a second, once at the end of the season. Okay? The other advantage due to the deciduous nature of the crop is that packing and storage is much easier. With the tropical grasses that we use at our location, because they are wet at time of harvest, this impacts your ability to store them and the methods you need to store them. Not to say that we can't, we can ensile that, okay? But this is an easier way, and it's much more familiar to a lot of our growers. Deciduous materials typically have lower ash than the tropicals. So this is total percent ash here. Switchgrass, giant miscanthus, sorghum, and elephant grass that we've tested in Mississippi State. The reason these are so high is because when the frost does come, it kills the plant and the nutrients are trapped in the dead plant. This is a biggie, okay? Percent potassium as a component of that ash. The tropicals keep a lot of that potassium in the upper portions, while the temperate grasses actually remove a tremendous amount down to their roots. The deciduous nature also allows us, if you are cropping this correctly, to interseed winter legumes. Under our system, a single biomass harvest removes about 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Even the poorest stands of winter legumes will provide 50 pounds of nitrogen. Some of them, the vetches, provide up to 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Okay, Dr. Sullenberger did a fantastic job on this. Warm season grasses have much more efficient photosynthetic capacity because they typically deflect oxygen, which is mistakenly picked up by this enzyme. This is not a physiology class. I'm not going to hold you to it. We won't test on that later. Okay? They do have excellent water use efficiency, and because their photosynthetic apparatus is so efficient, they do have fantastic nitrogen efficiency also. Okay, herbaceous means it's relatively low in lignin. And because it's relatively low in lignin, we can harvest with standard farm equipment. But because we're talking about such large acreage, the bales I showed before were considerably smaller than that. Because we are using such large acreage, our equipment probably needs to be supersized. And that's what you see with the baler here. Perennial comes back in the spring without replanting. This is a fantastic advantage with regard to any biomass crop. Although you don't see very much cover because the way we harvested this is switchgrass to the left, giant miscanthus to the right. Our Carter harvester essentially has a vacuum system on it, vacuums everything up off the ground. So when we convert it over to a new harvester, you see the amount of biomass that is left, but you do see the early spring growth. This was not seeded because as the plant, the yields get higher every year after the first year because there's an established crown here that has been recouping the nutrients from the previous year, and then it uses it for rapid spring growth. Okay. These grasses are extremely deep-rooted, and if you have the soil profile, they will go very far down. We typically think of these grasses as just surface biomass, but it is incredibly important that we consider the subsurface biomass. This is an image, it's actually out of National Geographic. This is upland switchgrass, which they use in the upper Midwest for biomass. In the South, we have a tremendous advantage that we use lowland switchgrass, which typically yields twice what its upper counterpart yields. And this is an important thing to remember when you're reading about switchgrass. You need to pay attention to where the switchgrass is coming from because it matters. Upland switchgrass yields considerably less than the lowland types. But this is an image of the extreme deep-rootedness. And again, this is also a function of the ability of air to get down into the soil profile. So this switchgrass is typically about waist high. So about 1 meter, okay? And so the roots go down easily 2 meters, while the plant material above ground is 1 meter, okay? Because we can't see the roots, we typically neglect the roots, and that is a big mistake with regard to the value of a lot of these grasses and biomass crops, okay? The advantage of being perennial is that you don't stir the soil. Stirring the soil with regard to soil carbon is a very bad thing because when you turn that soil over, you introduce oxygen. Oxygen stimulates the microbes, and the microbes consume the carbon. So the longer you can keep that ground unturned, the more soil carbon you will have, and that does tremendous things with regard to yield, with regard to nutrient stabilization, with regard to the living system that is soil. Some of my soil colleagues would faint that they heard me actually credit soil as being a living system. You see a prairie soil over here, and that deep black layer is a result of the organic matter and the living material above it. Okay, additional management with some of these. Establishment. You know, establishment is the real estate of these crops. You know, they say there are 3 things important about real estate, and that's location, location, location. With these crops, it's all about establishment. If you can't get them established, you're going to miss the market. It's just not going to happen. I've worked with several of my graduate students on establishment in switchgrass, which is one of the favored deciduous grasses. And we have made selections in Alamo for herbicide-resistant material because the big problem in seeding switchgrass is you can't typically take grassy weeds out of a grass. The herbicides just aren't specific enough. And so what we've done is we've made this grass, this switchgrass, resistant to a specific herbicide, not transgenically, but through human selection. We've also bred switchgrass that's going to be released this year that germinates extremely rapidly. So it doesn't have the seed dormancy that we see in native stands of switchgrass, And then you can barely see it here. I might have to get a little closer. There is a single row of switchgrass seedlings starting there, right there. And we have re-examined some of the seed safeners that were used in sorghum, and we were able to find a dosage rate and an application method that worked. We can treat sorghum seed with a safener, so it's essentially a herbicide antidote. Okay? So we treat the seed, plant the seed, and then spray a herbicide over it. Because the seed is treated with the antidote to the herbicide, only the seed that we planted comes up, and no other grass seeds come up. And so this gives us an advantage in establishment in switchgrass. Now, in giant miscanthus, establishment is typically through rhizome and crown division or through tissue culture. Tissue culture can generate lots of plants, but the reports out there from Poland, Germany, Denmark, and Spain indicate that tissue culture plugs have a very poor survival rate. About 20 to 30% of them die out. And that drops us below the economic threshold for an establishing field. So that leaves us with crown divisions or rhizomes, which generally work very well. But another important concept, some work put out by Emily Heaton, has shown that giant miscanthus does not tolerate competition by anything. Yields are always highest if you plant in a clean field that has no weeds. If you try to co-plant or plant with a nurse crop, even a nitrogen-fixing nurse crop, yields and percent establishment go down. Okay? So this is something that has to be planted absolutely in a barren field. One cut versus a two cut system for us. This data is out of Coffeyville, and we've done similar things at Starkville. This is a one cut system, this is a two cut system. Just like Dr. Sullenberger showed you in his, as you go through what happens, it was a bad year, 2002 anyway, but the impact of the two cut system is much more severe than a single cut system. The other thing that is an issue is in the first cut of a two cut system in these temperate grasses, we're removing a lot of nutrients, potassium and nitrogen being the big ones. And those have to be replaced, and that is an economic cost to the producer. All right, so to summarize, we're talking about perennial deciduous grasses. Switchgrass versus giant miscanthus. Switchgrass is North American native. It's seed fertile. You get coverage in 2 to 3 years. Really true yields in the 3rd year. Field duration about 15 years. And important, those of you who are reading about this, not familiar with the crop, you need to know whether they're, in the article, they're talking about upland or lowland types. Giant miscanthus, it's an Asian native, seed sterile, rhizome or tissue culture propagated. Takes 2 to 3 years to get coverage, but you can get yields in the 2nd year because a rhizome is considerably bigger than a seed, and so you get slightly faster establishment. This is an estimate from some of our fields, 8 to 10 years. No one has had fields out there that long. We're starting to see a decline in yield after about 8 years. We think we can restore that by running chisel plows through the field and breaking up the crowns and rejuvenating them. So the take-home message, and this is an important take-home message. You know, I talked about temperate species. Dr. Sullenberger talked about the species that were adapted to his area. And, you know, now after these 2 talks, I want to give you the take-home message. There's no one process and no one plant that's going to cover all of our demand or all of our needs. Each species has its own niche. Ruben Schmolsky's out there, Forest Products Lab. Trees are the long term, okay? These grasses get up and get yield way before trees can get that kind of yield, okay? But trees are there for the long term, and trees being long term modulate the annual yield over 15 or 20 years. Okay? Perennial grasses and temperate grasses are all important. That's all I have for you. This, you know, being in Georgia, this is the other bulldog. So.
All right, we have time for a few questions.
I know. I don't, oh, right here. Put these back up. I know.
The USDA AFRI-CAP program has put a lot of emphasis on woody species. Over half their money's essentially gone to woody species,
right,
not perennials. The sweet spot in the southeast, and I'm referring to southeast quadrant of the United States, would
right,
be the grasses you referred to. So it seems to me like there's somewhat of a disconnect there, and I'd like to, you know, this is probably more of a political question than a technical one, but does the SEC need to try to have some refocus on these species you talked about relative to our area, and if that's a true assessment, then what should we be talking about?
The short answer is yes, and the slightly longer answer is, you know, in the southeast, in the area I showed there, that is our area, trees are here. We have infrastructure to harvest and deliver trees already in place. While we can harvest these grasses and distribute them with the standard agricultural model, hay, we don't have long-term distribution and movement of these materials in place, and that needs to be established. So that is, from a grass perspective, that is our shortfall, and we need to address that in you hear this, Bill? In these CAP programs. Now, having said that, in our area, you know, we focus in the upper Midwest on these grasses. I mean, that gets all the attention. But they don't grow nearly as good in the upper Midwest as they do here. And so that's my short answer. Yes, we do need a refocus. We can produce grass, and we can produce it really well here.
I'm just curious, with the switchgrass, or right here, lowland
Okay.
switchgrass. Once it gets established and you harvest in that third year, is that economical for the grower at that point, or do you have to harvest yet again?
No.
To become
Okay, so
economical?
we have actually, in using the seed safener method, we can get an economic yield is considered 3 tons, which I think is a little bit on the low side of economically viable. We can actually get that 3-ton yield at the end of the first year, because using that seed safener, we have such good control of the weedy grasses, we can actually apply fertilizer the first year, which is always recommended against in a non-safened system. So we can actually get, and that's the other advantage of that safener, we can pull that economic yield forward considerably. So to answer your question, yes, you get it in the 3rd year. You don't have to go to the 4th year typically. But again, that's management issues. Bert? Yeah.
I was wondering if, in the view example that you showed, are those perennials also, or are those annuals?
With the,
When you replace the nitrogen with the view.
oh, I'm sorry, yeah. So one of them is a perennial. We use white clover, crimson clover, barometric, common vetch, hairy vetch. There's one more. Ball clover, thank you. Okay, and if I didn't credit, I mean, my co-authors were my graduate students. One of them is in the audience. If I didn't credit them now, before, I'm crediting them now. So all of them except white clover were annuals, but they all reseed. They all produce a tremendous amount of hard seed. And at our location, all of them reseed on their own. The only caveat is that the hairy vetch can be really aggressive. But boy, it puts out the nitrogen. I think we're out of time, aren't we? Oh, almost, okay. Is there another question?
Is there one more?
All right.
Okay. Thanks very much, Mike.